Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amour de Soi Wellness. And Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hey everyone, welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice and this is my co-host Donovan. And today I have a special guest, Brian Sachetta. He is the founder of Get Out of Your Head, a brand and book series focused on helping people overcome various forms of mental illness. Please welcome Brian. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So you have a really interesting story and background. So I'd love to hear a little more about your journey into doing what it is that you're doing now.
For sure. And I think it will be interesting. Donovan and I were chatting pre-interview, talking about how, we're both software engineers with some of the experience on the mental health side. So I think we'll probably cover some interesting topics on this podcast. But, in terms of my background, it was basically just like, the simple process of living my life, right? Like if I go to the age of 18, it was like, I'm in college. It's my first weekend of college. I had just had a brutal panic attack in front of this woman or girl at the time that, I was really interested in. And it was one of these whirlwind sorts of moments that like will stick with me forever. It was one of the most painful social interactions I've ever had. And so, I wake up on the other side of that interaction the next morning and I say to myself, like, I don't totally know what it is that I'm dealing with here, right? I'm 18 years old. I'm not a doctor. I don't have all these different terms at my disposal. Obviously this is 2008, which is not, 13 years ago. So Google was not the same. Amazon was not the same. The internet was not the same. So there wasn't this like just repository of information at our fingertips. I mean, there was some stuff out there, but not the same that it is today, right? So I'm sitting at my desk and I'm like, okay, whatever I experienced last night was so terrible. And I know that like, I usually call it nervousness or something like that. I've been nervous before, but I didn't totally know like this is anxiety. That was a panic attack, right? And so I'm trying to develop this common language that I can use to not only for myself, but also for looking up resources, finding out different things that I can learn and apply to my battles. So, I'm sitting there, I'm reading all these different ebooks that I pulled off the internet. And again, this is 2008. So like, we're not talking about going into Amazon and reading the top 100 books in anxiety, right? There's like only a couple of them and some of them are like really bad. And you're also getting books on like some random person's website, right? I don't even know what some of the names of these websites are, but they're certainly not totally legit, right? So as I'm going through this process, I'm trying to say like, okay, that's what, whatever happened last night, that's what happened to me. I also have some other experiences that I can take different things away from, but I'm learning all this new content. I'm deciphering things and trying to figure out like, okay, here's a new strategy. Let me see if this might work for me. Let me apply this to the next situation where I feel like I might be anxious or nervous in the future. And, if we fast forward years and years, it was kind of like what happened was I kind of bring this in on like the tech side of things, right? I was almost beta testing different strategies when it came to mental health. So I'm showing up to a job interview and I'm saying, I just heard about this idea in this specific book. Let me apply it here and see if it makes me feel a little bit less anxious or a little more confident or something like that. And so over the course of, I'm not really sure, like maybe if I had to guess, I'd say, we could say 10 years since my first book came out in 2018. I'm just applying these different strategies that I learned to different anxious situations, trying to figure out what works for me, what doesn't. And then on the other side of that, it was kind of like, I had always had this dream of like, I'm going to figure out this mental health thing. I'm going to share some of my insights with the world, either through a book or a blog. And so if we move to 2017, when I first started writing the book, it was kind of like, here I am. I've developed all these different ideas for myself. I've synthesized things from other folks. And I now feel like I have enough content where I can share it with the world and help others kind of not only alleviate some of their stress, but also just condense down the amount of time in which it takes them to learn and apply those things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a journey. I have a little bit of a different background going through like a psych degree and whatnot. So it's interesting for me to think about the angle of not having that vocabulary to be able to describe sort of your experiences, to not be able to search for what it is that you need. Because for me, like that was just a different piece. So on that sort of note, I would be curious. It sounds like you did a lot of experimentation, but if there were other strategies that you used to kind of weed through things that seem like they might work and strategies that seem like they might not work. Because again, you said some number of those resources were just bunk. I'm curious if that was all experimentation or if there was some other process going on.
Yeah, I think it was mostly experimentation. And it's funny because hearing your side of the story, right? Like you being a psych major, it's like I had these resources, these ideas and concepts at my disposal, right? It's like, so the lens through which I viewed my experiences was much different than yours. So it's funny because like in my first book, I said, at the time, the world wasn't totally what it was in terms of like, knowing what all these things are and having all this research and whatnot. But some of that is just the fact that I came from a background that wasn't, I don't want to say technical, but it wasn't medicinal. It wasn't, I wasn't a psych major. I wasn't in a clinical field, right? So it was just kind of interesting seeing that. But so I'm viewing all of these experiences through my lens of like, I'm just trying to make sense of what I'm going through. I don't have that common language, right? But so basically that led me to just say, let me dive into all this different content that I can find. And some of it was just random, right? In terms of like, on this day, I happened to find this book, or I filled the time that I had by reading this resource or whatever. So one of those early resources that I found, and something that I talk about a lot, I actually, funny enough, I wrote a blog post about it this week, was talking about visualization when it comes to anxiety. And so this book was like, one of the core concepts in it was like, okay, so the next time you find yourself anxious about something, right? Picture yourself in the situation, see yourself, whatever it is you're trying to do, like see yourself in the office of the place where you're going to give an interview or have an interview, right? See yourself talking to the person, thinking well, not being anxious, whatever it is. And so I'm thinking to myself, this is one of the first resources I've ever read. This was one of the resources that popped up, pretty quickly on the internet. So this person must know what they're talking about. And I'm not here to say like that person didn't. I'm just saying that it didn't work for me, right? So when I think of visualization and anxiety, what I say is like, if you're already anxious about something, or you have fear surrounded around an outcome that you want, or a situation that you're about to go into, it's really hard to think about that event or that outcome without also expanding upon your fears. So here I am, diving into this new content, thinking to myself, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. I'm going to go apply this to every situation that I can. And then years later, I'm on the other side of it. I'm like, this really hasn't worked ever. And so if I'm being honest with myself, it's time to develop a new strategy, right? And so again, going back to just sort of the random adventure, it was like, I finally abandoned that strategy. I moved on to a new one. I found whatever resources I could online, whether it was different blogs or different podcasts. I'm probably a little too early for podcasts, but that came somewhere in the journey, right? Different books and things of that nature. So it was just a random adventure, but here I am on the other side of it, having published, that first book in 2018, hoping to help some folks. So that's where I am.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you make a really good point that I think is really important for our audience to recognize that, anxiety, as an anxiety expert myself, I don't see it as like, oh, this solution works well for everyone. It doesn't always work out. There's so many options now, especially now with the plethora of tools and tips and authors and experts out there. There's just so many approaches. So I think it is like a journey that people have to understand that, like, yeah, if one tool doesn't work for you, to explore a different one. I'm curious what tools, so clearly visualization didn't work for you. What were some of the tools that did work well for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just reflecting on my brand itself, right? The name Get Out of Your Head, like all of my strategies, especially because I don't come from the clinical side of things, like I can't diagnose someone, I can't treat someone. I can only, give advice or offer strategies, right? All of the strategies that I give revolve around the idea of getting out of our heads, putting our fears down, jumping out of, loops of negative thoughts. So for me, everything, and again, everybody's different, right? My strategies might not necessarily resonate with every person, but what the approach that I have in the first book, and it's interesting, you use this idea or term, tool, right? So like my book is called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. And so the idea is like, here I am throwing all these different ideas at you. Some are going to stick, some aren't. But what I want you to do in the end of the book is to come away with some toolkit where you say, you presented me these 20 strategies. I'm going to pick these 10, put them into my little tool belt over here. And then the next time I approach a specific situation, I may know which one I want to use specifically in that situation, or I may just say, all of these sort of work for me. So let me kind of try them out and see what happens, right? So when it comes to specific strategies like that, I actually have a framework in the book. It's the first half of the book. I call them the 10 steps to getting out of your head. And those are basically like 10 different tools that you can try out that would help you if you're already fearful or anxious, like you're going into some situation that's making you worried, or you're just thinking about something, right? You've fallen into your head. These are 10 different strategies that you can try out to potentially walk back some of that fear. So just to touch upon a couple of them really quickly, my favorite one actually is breathing. And it's funny because so much of the stuff that I talk about in the book and in my blog and just on podcasts and whatnot, like sometimes it comes off as like hilariously obvious, right? It's like, oh yeah, just breathe, like, I don't want to sound like I have my head in the clouds or whatever. And it's just like this random, like not really effective strategies that I'm putting forth. But when we dive a little bit deeper into a concept like breathing, right, we realize how the nervous system works. We realize that when we're breathing deeply, especially when we're breathing out, we're activating our parasympathetic nervous system. And that is, the opposite of our fight or flight system, the one that's linked to so much of the experience that we know as anxiety. So that's one that I really like, a strategy that works for me a lot because it helps me get out of my head. It helps me calm down. And it's also always available to us, right? Like as long as we have the awareness to say, I need to breathe right now. All we have, like our lungs are always here, where we can always do that. Whereas like we might not be able to like go to the gym and blow off some steam, right? We might be in the middle of the workday or watching our kids or something like that. So that's a strategy I love. Another one that I use, just to give another quick one, would be like reciting a mantra. So I think a lot of listeners will be familiar with mantras, but I just, when I refer to them, like what I refer to them as is just like short, emotional, powerful phrases. So these are just, things that you're going to recite to yourself that help you shift your thinking, get out of your head, get out of those thoughts of those loops of rumination, if you will. Right. So going with the theme, one of the ones that I use a lot comes from personal development guru, Tony Robbins, who a lot of folks will be familiar with. He says, if you get in your head, you're dead. And I just love it. It's like, it's so in your face, right? It's just like, and I will scream it to myself. I will pound my chest if I have to. I'll say, if you get in your head, you're dead. If you get in your head, you're dead. If you get in your head, you're dead. And for me, I just find that, being able to radically shift what I'm thinking about, giving myself a totally brand new focus allows me to drop some of those worry patterns. And then, at the same time, some of those fears and physical sensations kind of melt away as well.
Yeah, that's really great couple strategies that people can use. One piece that I want to highlight or just add on to, going back to sort of the conversation we've been having around experimentation and figuring out what tools work for you. For me, when I first picked up mantras or started trying to use them or thinking about them, I didn't recognize how important it is to pick something that actually emotionally resonates with you. You have to make sure it's something that actually matters to you, because I did something similar at one point. And I took a mantra from some random book, again, like you were talking about, like some dark corner of the internet, but it had no meaning to me whatsoever. And for the longest time, I thought mantras, they're not helpful. They don't do anything. But the difference is if the phrase you're saying actually has meaning to you, and mine was something around like, it was like, I'm a king or some shit like that I just do not resonate with at all. But that's what it said in the book. So that's what I copied. Anyway, knowing just how important it is that if you want to use that tactic to pick something that does resonate with you, and it could be any number of phrases, it could be something you come up with, something you borrow, but just make sure that it actually is something you believe to a degree, and you will have much better results than I did in the past.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, one thing I want to add to Donovan's point, though, when you were saying get out of my head or you're dead, or get out of your head or you're dead, whatever it is, it's also in that the way you say it and like radiate it makes the difference, in my opinion. Like if you were like, oh, get out of your head, you're dead, versus like the way you said it and how it came across for me was very like powerful. And I think that in itself, it shifts the energy of like anxious, nervous to like, no, not today, get out of your head or you're dead kind of. Yeah. So I think that energy shift too, while saying the mantra, can make the difference as well.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And I think it speaks to what Donovan had just said. And it's also kind of like, it also speaks to the fact that like, if you read these mantras in a book, you're not going to get that emotion, right? So it's difficult. Like you almost need to see or hear somebody do it in real time. Otherwise it's like, you're reading these 4 words on a page and they don't really mean anything to you.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. So I've been curious, how do you feel like your kind of circling back to your tech background, how do you feel your tech background kind of gave you an advantage or disadvantage in exploring the field of healing anxiety?
I love that question. I don't know, like I've gotten flavors of it before, but not that specific one. I would say if I start with the disadvantages first, I mean, it's the most obvious one, just in terms of like a very technical background or just, being in software development. I think it breeds the ability or the tendency to overthink, right? I'm writing software. So I'm like, okay, I look at everything through the lens of like, how do I fix this? How do I take this problem? How do I break it down? How do I apply a new solution or whatever? Right. And so there's always this like logical thinking things through, maybe overthinking things, over engineering problems. Right. And one of the things that, we've talked about here that I've learned on my journey was like, there are some things that you can apply logic to, and there are others that you definitely can't. And you almost have, it's almost kind of like the serenity prayer, where it's like, allow me to know the wisdom between the difference of, it's like, allow me to know the things I can change, the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference, or I'm messing it up a little bit, but it's, along those lines. And so it's like, as I went along further on my journey, it really became apparent to me that like this over logical way of looking at the world was not helping me when it came to my mental health. So what I mean by that was like, I would think to myself, okay, I'm going on a date tonight. So let me sit down, let me plan this all out. Let me think about how I'm going to evade my fear, how I'm going to get it to go away. I don't know, just plotting through the entire situation. Right. And after years and years of doing that and realizing that the results weren't very good, I finally realized like, hey, maybe these tendencies of like overthinking things aren't really helping me when it comes, to anxiety and depression and whatnot. So that was kind of the first, to answer the first part of or one part of the question, like how is the tech background like hinder me a little bit? I would say on the other side of things, like how does it help me? I think that it gives me a unique perspective. I don't necessarily know if it's like an amazing one, but I've said this on a few podcasts recently. It's like folks have asked me, is comparing tech and software development with anxiety, is that like the best way to describe things? And I would say, I don't know. It's just the way that I know how to make sense of the world, how I know how to make sense of my experiences. Right. So for example, like one of the things that I realized was, and I think Donovan, you both may be able to relate to this, but I'm sure Donovan will especially. So when it like I have this concept that I talk about in the book called recursive anxiety. And so when we're writing software, right, a recursive function is one that calls itself. So I don't know if I want to jump in. I don't know if I like this. I'm deciding how technical I want to be, but like, so if we wrote a function, right, that says like, go get me the second number in the Fibonacci sequence, right? In order to get that number, we need to know, just because the Fibonacci sequence is basically the third number, or I guess the number that you want in the sequence is equal to the values of the previous two. So it depends on what you start with. Some folks start with 0, some folks start with 1, but the sequence basically goes like 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. So basically what you could do is you could pass a value into this function and say, get me the related value for that spot in the sequence, right? And so that function, if you write it properly, it needs to call itself. It needs to say, okay, if I want to get the value of the fifth Fibonacci number, I need to know what 4 and 3 are. In order to know what 4 is, I need to know what 3 and 2 are, and so on and so forth. And so when it comes to anxiety, we have this recursive function as well, where we start thinking about something, our anxiety calls itself again, thinks about something else, makes us more fearful. All of a sudden, we're going way down this path of like, 15 minutes go by. We've been ruminating on all sorts of different ideas, feeling way worse than we were when we jumped into our heads, tried to maybe solve whatever it is that we were trying to solve or think through it. And then, another concept related to, and it goes back to recursion, but another idea that comes from computer science is like, when it comes to looping things, right? We need to have some default condition that breaks us out of that loop. Otherwise, it's never going to stop. And then the program that we're running may run out of memory, or usually the systems that run these programs will just detect that you're in an infinite loop, and they'll just stop them. The program will crash, right? So we obviously don't want to crash, whatever the real life equivalent of that is. But so basically, when it comes to recursive anxiety, we need these different things that allow us to break us out of our thought patterns. So we need to be able to say, hey, I have the awareness that I am in the middle of one of these loops. I'm going to apply one of my mantras. I'm going to breathe deeply. I'm going to trying to think of some of the other ones, right? I'm going to do something that makes me feel better right now, immediately, right? I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to go for a walk, something like that. So when it comes to that, the other part of the question in terms of like, how did the computer science background benefit me in terms of mental health? I felt like I could make these sort of like random connections that I think some folks might be able to connect to, or they might resonate with folks a little bit more. I don't know for sure that it's the best way to describe things, but I think if I'm, niching down and trying to reach a tech audience, I think the parallels, I would hope at least are interesting to folks.
Yeah, I think coming from the opposite angle, having done the psych stuff first, then got into the computer science stuff, I think metaphors like that are going to really, really connect well with that certain audience in a way that is more likely to land than I think some of the traditional messaging, right? Some of the things that you generally get out of, the self-help bubble or circle or sphere, in my experience, doesn't land particularly well with the tech community. So having some different metaphors and some different ways to speak about sort of the same concepts, I think is extremely valuable, because it opens up those conversations in a way. Again, everyone's different, but in general, I think is going to be more applicable to those people, or at least something they're more interested in.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Yeah. And as someone, with a medical background and not really a technical background, although I feel like technically competent, but not as like technical as, most engineers. I have worked with a lot of software engineers, and, that's the trend I see, is like their brain is go, 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 go. Like their profession is designed to think a lot and problem solve and troubleshoot. And so I get how you could really you get them. Like I can kind of get them to some degree, but I can't really fully understand what it is to work in tech, especially with the pressure and the high demands to deliver and all those things. So I think, having that background can really connect people to maybe even open their eyes to get some help and see that they don't have to be in this, turn on your engineer brain when you're at work, but let's learn ways and strategies to unplug the engineer brain when we're out of work. I think it's important to find that balance.
So there's another totally different direction that I wanted to ask a couple questions in, which is, it sounds like we've mostly been talking about, and maybe this is the whole focus of your book, maybe not, strategies for in the moment, right? Mm-hmm. I have some sort of a talk I'm about to give in 10 minutes. I feel super heightened. I'm going to go do some breathing. Do you have, or have you thought about or explored some of the strategies around what people can do to work through anxiety when it's not in these moments? And I think, maybe one example that first comes to mind is, hey, there are all these strategies, and you mentioned you need to have awareness of breathing, right? For one example of a potential tool. Do you have any strategies around okay, well, I'm not freaking out right now, but I know tomorrow I have to give a presentation. How am I going to increase the chance that I catch myself and remember to actually do this breathing, as opposed to getting caught in one of these loops?
I love that question. The reason why is because I think that the way that you asked it, right? If I break it into two parts, I would say, let me address the second one, the second part first. So the idea of I don't have this thing in 10 minutes. I have this thing in a day to address. I'm giving a speech or whatever it is. I would make the argument that is actually an in the moment thing, right? You are, maybe you aren't worried right now, but you are worried about being worried. You're almost, I don't know, recursively anxious or meta anxious or something like that, right? And so the same strategies apply. I mean, I will say, if I kind of caveat this, it is difficult to have that awareness. That's one of the biggest pieces. So when you say again, I'm not nervous right now, I know I will be in 24 hours. How do I remember to apply these strategies, right? That is, I just can't sugarcoat it. That is one of the most challenging parts of this entire battle. I would say in that realm, and I don't know, this is kind of a selfish plug or whatever, right? But it's I have, if you read my first book, I have a resource in there that you can get online. It's a printout of the 10 steps. Print it out, put it on your wall, carry it in your pocket, laminate it, whatever you have to do. That way it's always with you. You're going to this speech, you put it in your pocket, you get nervous, you put your hands in your pocket, you pull out the list, something like that. Again, selfish plug there, shameless plug, whatever. But when it comes to the other part of the question, which was it was more around less in the moment stuff, more high level, right? So it's funny because the book itself is broken into two parts. The first part, I call it like zooming in. Those are those specific acute anxious situations where you're already fearful, you're trying to back yourself out of them. The second part is more of the high level practices, like things that you can do just in your life to become a little bit less anxious overall, or maybe fall into those fearful situations less often. So there are a lot of different strategies in that second half of the book. If I were to cover a couple of them really quickly, I think one that a lot of folks, a lot of listeners will have heard already is just developing like a daily meditation practice, right? So sitting down with your thoughts and just allowing them to move through your mind without reacting to them. It's a different way of going to the gym. I mean, or a different kind of, I don't know, it's a workout for your mind, some people sometimes say, right? So it's like we're developing this muscle to be able to ignore specific thoughts, not attach to them. And over time, that allows us to be a little bit less anxious, because the next time something, even if we're not in a meditation session, right? The next time a negative thought pops into our minds, if we've built up some of that muscle, we might be able to say to ourselves, hey, I know how to handle this thing. Rather than ruminate on it, turn it over, I can just drop it, right? I can let it go. I can just let it pass through my mind. So that's a really important one that I try to meditate every day, but it doesn't happen every day. I'll be totally honest. The other one, and this one I actually haven't talked on a lot of podcasts before, but it's one that I love, which is and it's sort of, I don't know if folks that are listening would be like familiar with a Mark Manson or someone like that, a really popular self-help author. He has his most famous book is the Subtle Art of Not Giving a Blank. And so I have a chapter that, if I'm trying to compare it to something, it's similar to that. I didn't really write it with that in mind, but folks might be able to connect to it in that regard. And it's basically like the chapter itself is called Care Less, Open More. And it's basically just like allowing ourselves to feel our anxious symptoms, allowing ourselves to share with other folks, right? Like say, one of the things I think is that we keep all of these, especially men, right? Like we keep our emotions to ourselves. We don't want to show other people. We don't want to tell other people because we don't want to come off as like wusses or something like that, right? And so what ends up happening is it's this vicious cycle where it's like you go to some anxious situation, you don't realize that everybody is anxious around you or something like that, right? And if we were to say, you know what, I'm gonna look at this anxiety and I'm gonna tell other folks, hey, I'm anxious right now. I'm worried. I'm not afraid to talk about it. Other folks might come up and be like, hey, funny story. We're just as anxious as you are right now. And then all of a sudden, like the entire energy level of the room changes, right? And it's like, we don't have to be so anxious anymore because we're all on the same wavelength, right? I think one of the other things is just being able to open up. And then even if it's not everybody in the room, maybe one person comes up to you and says like, hey, I actually deal with some of those same things. I also, I used to be afraid of flying. And this is one thing that helped me get over that. You talked about being afraid of flying. Like, here's a resource that you could check out, right? So it's basically, again, it's a vague high level strategy. And that kind of speaks to that second part of the book. But it's more like if we can develop these almost characteristics of in ourselves and say like, I'm willing to talk about these things. I'm willing to not be so uptight about them or whatever, right? We find that the vicious cycle kind of turns itself around. We open ourselves up to more resources, to more connections, more support. And I think in the long run, it's again, it's not an immediate strategy. It's kind of like meditation, right? We're building this muscle, but over time, it leads us to less anxiety overall.
Mm-hmm. That kind of what I'm hearing in what you were just sharing is that like, you'll need to find a way to come to terms and acceptance of the things and just be open and sharing it with people. Because I was just visualizing just like a bunch of stressed out engineers in like a room. And I'm like, if just one of them could just like share that, and maybe like all of them are like, oh yes, this is a really toxic work environment, things need to change. Like if they could come together and maybe like tell their boss or management, that could make a difference on their stress levels. But if they never open up about it, they're just like nose to the grindstone kind of a thing, then nothing is ever going to change too in that respect. So I think it is important to like open up and share. And those are great strategies.
Definitely. It's not to make light of any of the things that we go through, right? It's not to say like it's easy to do that sort of thing. It's just to say like, hey, other people do experience what we experience. It's okay to open up about them.
Right.
I'd be curious because I've got to imagine some number of people have experienced both positive instances and negative instances. So I'd be curious where you think places are that are a little bit softer or safer to start building this muscle, right? Because I've got to imagine some number of people have gone to some situation and gone, hey, you know what? I'm kind of nervous. I'm kind of anxious, and been in a group that is not particularly conducive to that, and been like, what is wrong with you? Like, we're just doing this. We're just going to this place or whatever else. I'd be curious to your thoughts on places that are a little bit easier to start that journey, because I'm sure over time you build up the muscle, and then you have more of an internal grounding, right, where you're able to say that with confidence and not feel as much impact from external influences. But at the start, it's got to be a lot scarier if you do not get the type of positive reinforcement that you're hoping for.
Yeah, you definitely hit the nail on the head on that one. I think one of the reasons that we sometimes are afraid of talking about our feelings is maybe in middle school or high school or whatever it was, right? We did talk about our feelings, and they weren't received very well. So I think as we get older, we learn to almost undo some of that learning. We learn to say to ourselves, hey, whatever I took away from my past experiences, maybe those things don't apply so much anymore, right? Maybe those are old beliefs or old lessons that I learned that don't serve me. And so, yeah, I mean, you definitely make a great point in terms of like being careful with the audience that you choose, right? And I that's one of the tough things about self-help, right? Is like, we could throw a strategy out there, somebody could take it, it could go wrong, and then all of a sudden it's like, this person told me to do this and it was a really bad idea. So I think what I would recommend for folks listening is like, start small, start in trustful circles, right? If you have a best friend, if you have a parent or a sibling, somebody that you can feel comfortable going to, and they're not going to judge you, just kind of expand out from there. And even if you don't expand from there, if you just develop a relationship with one person where you can share some of these feelings, maybe it's a significant other, something like that. I think it's important to just, I don't want to say like read the room, but almost like know your audience, understand like who it is that you're talking to, and so do a little bit of like a pre-screening in terms of like, I've thought about Donovan's question. I've thought, could this person or this group of people not be receptive, and just be a little bit cognizant of that.
I also want to highlight, as I'm thinking about it, the difference between an N of 0 and an N of 1 is huge, right? As long as you have at least one person to explore some of these thoughts and feelings with, I feel like you can make a lot of progress on it and then start working and building from there. But as someone who has done this myself historically, keeping this stuff to yourself just indefinitely can really build up, and you don't get any of the outlet, you don't get any additional strategies or support or any really confidence that what you're doing is helping or anything of the sort. So I just want to highlight, like, as I'm thinking about it, just at least having the one person, finding one person where you're comfortable doing this and building from there is so much different than just taking the journey alone.
Totally agree.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I feel like the more you're able to share, and maybe that is just one person, but it's just like releasing the gas valves from all this like pressure and anxiety that it's like, oh, I can release. And I find that like the more people I share with, and now I feel like over the years I've been able to share relatively easy, but it wasn't always easy from the beginning, where I did struggle with it and I would just keep it to myself. But over the years in developing and like sharing with my own inner circle, but then going beyond that and just sharing with pretty much anyone, and having that freedom and not really having a concern if they judge me. But honestly, there's usually not like a negative ramification, like I'll get fired or something, because I own my own business. So I don't have to like worry about that. But generally I don't care if people judge me, because people will be people. And, I have a stronger sense of myself in a way. Yeah,
definitely. And just to reiterate that it is a journey, right? None of this is going to come overnight. So it's just taking the little steps and then turning around after time and saying, hey, I've made some progress, right?
Totally. Awesome, Brian. So it's been such a pleasure to have you on our show. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we wrap up? Obviously your book, Get Out of Your Head, go get that today, getoutofyourhead.com. Anything else you want to share?
Those are kind of the two main things, I guess I would say. Feel free to connect with me on Instagram. The handle that I use for the book stuff is Get Out of Your Head Books. And then I always end by saying to folks, like, if you're listening and you're struggling, or you have a story to tell, or you feel like you can't share it with someone, please feel free to reach out with me. Know that you're not alone. You have partners in this battle, some folks that might be able to give you some hope and some wisdom, and help you battle on. So
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Brian, for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and then go and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you get notified when the next video comes out. If you check out in the description below, go to my website where you can get my free fast and easy guide to stress relief. Thanks again for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.